When you think of Hollywood's toughest gangsters, one name almost always comes to mind: James Cagney. But behind the sharp suits and snarling one-liners, there was a man yearning for something very different. Cagney wasn't just a rough-and-tumble streetwise actor. He was a trained vaudevillian, a lover of music, rhythm, and stagecraft. His real dream? To be remembered as a song and dance man, lighting up the screen not with violence, but with tap shoes and a dazzling smile. Yet Hollywood had other plans. His explosive performance in The Public Enemy, 1931, especially the infamous grapefruit in the face scene, turned him into the ultimate symbol of urban toughness. Audiences couldn't get enough. Studios saw dollar signs. And suddenly James Cagney was trapped. Despite winning an Oscar for Yankee Doodle Dandy, showcasing his incredible singing and dancing talent, the public, and more tragically, the industry, refused to let go of the gangster image. Over the years, he fought studio executives, battled for better roles, and even sued Warner Brothers, a rare and daring move at the time. But no matter how many victories he won behind the scenes, Cagney knew one thing: in the eyes of the world, he would always be the guy ready to throw a punch, not tap out a tune. He once joked with a wry smile that audiences wouldn't be satisfied until he kicked someone's teeth in between dance numbers. For Cagney, fame wasn't a celebration. It was a lifelong struggle to be seen for who he really was, not the tough guy Hollywood insisted he be. She was Hollywood royalty, dazzling, commanding, unstoppable. And yet, for Elizabeth Taylor, playing Cleopatra was less a crowning achievement and more a personal battlefield. When production on Cleopatra began, the expectations were sky high. Taylor was paid an unprecedented $1 million. A figure that sent shockwaves through the industry. The world watched as she slipped into the robes of the legendary Egyptian queen. But behind the glitter, a nightmare was unfolding. Plagued by constant rewrites, on-set power struggles, and illnesses that nearly cost Taylor her life, Cleopatra spiraled out of control. A budget that was supposed to be reasonable ballooned to $44 million. A fortune in 1960s Hollywood. The tabloids had a field day, especially when Taylor's love affair with co-star Richard Burton ignited a global scandal. And through it all, Taylor herself was miserable. She later confessed that she hated the film's bloated extravagance, hated the endless reshoots, hated how Cleopatra transformed her in the public eye from a serious actress into a walking headline. Even though the film eventually found success internationally, it forever altered her career. No longer just an actress, Elizabeth Taylor became a spectacle, scrutinized, worshipped, judged. Cleopatra was supposed to secure her place in cinematic history. Instead, it locked her into an image she could never fully escape. A queen on screen, a prisoner of fame off it. In 1962, a former bodybuilder and working-class Scotsman stepped onto the screen as a character no one quite knew what to expect. Within months, Sean Connery was the face of a phenomenon. Dr. No launched James Bond onto the world stage. And with it, a new kind of hero. Cool, ruthless, magnetic. Connery brought a dangerous charm that audiences had never seen before. But while fans embraced him as the ultimate spy, Connery himself was already uneasy about the price of fame. As early as From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, Connery began chafing against the machine. The grueling pace of filming, sometimes 2 Bond films in a single year, left him exhausted. Worse, the intense spotlight stripped away his personal life. Paparazzi followed him relentlessly, invading his privacy even during private vacations. Connery famously grew so frustrated that during the filming of You Only Live Twice in Japan, he refused to give interviews and even punched a persistent photographer who wouldn't leave him alone. Beyond the glare of fame, there was the creative suffocation. To the producers, Bond was a product. Slick, repeatable, and profitable. They didn't want evolution. They wanted formula. Connery, an actor who had trained in Shakespeare and dreamt of a diverse career, found himself trapped in a loop of seductions, gadgets, and catchphrases. In private interviews, Connery was blunt. He said he hated that damned James Bond. Not because he hated the character, but because he hated how it consumed everything else. After You Only Live Twice, he walked away, declaring he would never play Bond again. But Hollywood, as always, had its temptations. Offered an unprecedented salary, equivalent to over $7 million today, and creative promises for Diamonds Are Forever. Connery returned, but with a heart no longer in it. Even when he was coaxed back a final time in 1983's Never Say Never Again, a Bond film produced outside the official Eon franchise, it felt less like a triumphant return and more like a resignation. Sean Connery reshaped cinema with James Bond, and in many ways, he never fully escaped. In the early 1940s, no one epitomized sultry, enigmatic Hollywood glamour quite like Veronica Lake. With a single strategic wave of golden hair falling over one eye, she ignited a phenomenon that swept America. The peekaboo hairstyle wasn't just a fashion statement, it became a cultural obsession. Posters, magazines, and movie screens all celebrated her hypnotic image. Paramount Studios molded her into the ultimate noir goddess, pairing her again and again with Alan Ladd in shadowy thrillers like This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia. But behind the perfectly styled hair and cool, detached persona, Veronica Lake was deeply frustrated. She longed to be taken seriously as an actress, not just remembered as the girl with the hair. Then history intervened. During World War II, the U.S. government launched a campaign asking Lake to alter her signature look. Too many women working in factories were imitating her style, and industrial accidents were rising. When Lake obliged, tying her hair back, the unthinkable happened. Her box office appeal plummeted almost overnight. Paramount panicked. Executives blamed her directly for the financial slump, treating her not as an artist, but as a malfunctioning product. Roles dried up. Critical interest faded. Her attempts to shift into more dramatic, mature performances were largely ignored by a system that had decided long ago what she should be, and nothing more. By the 1950s, Veronica Lake had all but vanished from Hollywood screens. She took work as a barmaid in New York City under her birth name, Connie Ockelman, a ghost of the silver screen she once ruled. Though later attempts at a comeback were met with nostalgia, the truth was harsh. Hollywood had loved her silhouette more than her soul. Veronica Lake remains an icon of old Hollywood beauty. But beneath the cascading hair was an artist who spent her life trying, and failing, to be seen for who she really was. Before he became America's first Superman, George Reeves had already established himself as a respected and accomplished actor. He made his film debut in 1939 with a small but proud role in Gone with the Wind, and over the next decade, he built a steady career with performances that reflected both his professionalism and his deep respect for the craft of acting. When the opportunity came to portray Superman in the Adventures of Superman television series, Reeves embraced the role wholeheartedly. He recognized the importance of the character, especially in the lives of young audiences, and he approached Superman with sincerity, dignity, and a sense of moral purpose that defined his portrayal and endeared him to millions. But everything changed in 1951. The show was a sensation. Millions of children across the country saw Reeves as a real-life hero, larger than life, invincible, the man who could leap tall buildings in a single bound. But the costume became his cage. Off-screen, Reeves struggled deeply with the limits the role placed on his career. Casting agents and studios no longer saw a versatile actor. They saw Superman, and nothing else. Film offers dried up. Even small appearances were denied to him. Fans approached him in public expecting the Man of Steel, noble, flawless, and he felt increasingly like an imposter wearing a mask he couldn't remove. According to close friends, he sank into periods of depression. His attempts to branch out, directing television pilots, seeking stage roles, were often met with polite rejection or indifference. Christopher Lee was a man of formidable talents, a classically trained actor, fluent in multiple languages, a scholar of history and literature. When he first donned the cape in Horror of Dracula, 1958, he did more than play a monster. He brought Count Dracula to life with elegance, menace, and profound humanity. Through Lee's interpretation, Dracula became more than a creature of the night. He was commanding, tragic, seductive, a timeless figure reimagined for a new era with intelligence and power. Audiences around the world were captivated, and rightly so. Christopher Lee's Dracula would become one of the defining performances in the history of cinema. Yet, as the years passed, the demands of the industry began to weigh heavily. The sequels multiplied, often without the care or depth the character deserved. Scripts grew thinner. The nuance that Lee had once poured into Dracula was gradually replaced by repetition and formula. In Dracula, Prince of Darkness Lee, dissatisfied with the dialogue, chose to portray the Count without speaking, relying entirely on his physical presence to maintain the character's dignity. Christopher Lee never disrespected Dracula. To the contrary, he fought to uphold the complexity and grandeur of the character, even when the material around him faltered. What disheartened him was not the role itself, but how the industry sought to reduce Dracula, and in turn himself, to something simpler, something easier to sell. Financial necessity and professional obligation kept bringing him back to the Cape. But in his heart, Lee longed for broader horizons, for Shakespearean stages, historical dramas, and roles that challenged the full range of his gifts. Later, with acclaimed performances in The Wicker Man, The Man with the Golden Gun, and The Lord of the Rings, he proved to the world what those close to him always knew, that he was an artist of extraordinary depth, capable of far more than a single role could contain. Christopher Lee gave Dracula his dignity, his power, and his soul. And while the world remembers him in The Vampire's shadow, those who look closer will see the legacy of a man who honored the character, even as he struggled to free himself from the chains of a system that could not see beyond the Cape. In the post-war years, Betty Hutton was pure dynamite on screen. Vivacious, brimming with energy, and armed with a voice that could fill an auditorium without a microphone, she was Hollywood's answer to a public hungry for optimism and joy. By 1950, she was already a rising star, celebrated for her performances in films like The Miracle of Morgan's Creek and The Perils of Pauline. Then came Annie Get Your Gun, a role that seemed tailor-made for her talents. But behind the scenes, her casting was not the result of triumph. It was the product of crisis. Judy Garland, who had originally been slated for the lead, had been dismissed from the project due to health and personal struggles. When Hutton was called in as her replacement, she stepped onto a set still mourning Garland's absence. The welcome was anything but warm. Crew members still loyal to Garland treated Hutton with suspicion and coolness. Every smile she brought to the character of Annie Oakley was hard-won. A triumph of professionalism over an atmosphere heavy with resentment. Hutton later recalled the experience as one of the most emotionally draining of her career. Despite the tensions, Annie Get Your Gun was a resounding success. It became one of the highest-grossing musicals of the decade, and Hutton's portrayal of Annie, brash, spirited, and relentlessly charming, won over audiences across the country. But that success came at a hidden cost. Hollywood, always eager for easy categories, now saw Betty Hutton as one thing, and one thing only: the loud, energetic, larger-than-life girl next door, a characterization that left little room for artistic growth. As the golden age of movie musicals began to wane, Hutton's career trajectory faltered. Serious, dramatic roles, the kind she longed for, were out of reach. Producers wanted the exuberant songbird of Annie Get Your Gun, not the woman yearning to show her depth. She attempted to transition into television, starring briefly in The Betty Hutton Show in the late 1950s. But the era of the grand musical had passed, and Hollywood moved on. Behind the spotlight, Hutton faced mounting personal struggles: financial hardship, broken marriages, battles with depression and addiction. Without the constant validation of the screen, the pressures she had long fought to suppress overwhelmed her. In her later years, Betty Hutton found peace far from the cameras, eventually earning a degree in psychology and working as a counselor, helping others find strength where she had once struggled to find her own. Reflecting on her career, she spoke of Annie Get Your Gun with bittersweet affection. It had given her fame beyond measure, but it had also trapped her in a role she could never fully grow beyond: a triumph and a cage. Betty Hutton remains one of the brightest sparks of Hollywood's musical era, a woman whose true range was far greater than the industry ever allowed her to show. Bela Ferenc Dejo Blasco, known to the world as Bela Lugosi, was born in 1882 in the small town of Lugos in the Kingdom of Hungary. From an early age, he was drawn to the dramatic arts, immersing himself in the works of Shakespeare and the classics of European theater. Bela Lugosi quickly earned a reputation on the Hungarian stage as a serious, magnetic presence. His performances were grounded in the traditions of the Old World, valuing discipline, emotional depth, and a strong connection to the audience. Political turmoil following World War I forced Lugosi to emigrate, and he eventually made his way to the United States. In America, with little knowledge of the English language, he faced daunting challenges, taking small acting jobs wherever he could find them. Yet his determination never wavered. Slowly, through perseverance and undeniable charisma, he built a new life on the New York stage. In 1927, opportunity struck. Lugosi was cast as Count Dracula in a Broadway production of Bram Stoker's classic novel. His performance was nothing short of electrifying. With a deliberate, almost mesmerizing delivery and an aristocratic bearing, he redefined the vampire not as a grotesque monster, but as a figure of seductive danger and eerie elegance. The stage version of Dracula was a tremendous success, and Lugosi became a sensation. When Universal Studios adapted Dracula for the screen in 1931, Lugosi lobbied hard for the role. He was ultimately cast, and his film performance immortalized him. His portrayal of Dracula was iconic, smooth, menacing, and hauntingly charismatic. Audiences were captivated, and the image of Lugosi's Dracula, the piercing eyes, the flowing cape, the calculated movements, became etched into popular culture permanently. However, the overwhelming success of Dracula brought unforeseen consequences. Lugosi's performance was so definitive, so singular, that Hollywood could no longer envision him beyond the vampire's shadow. Despite his range as an actor, he found himself typecast almost immediately. Offers for other roles were rare, and when they came, they were often for characters that echoed the dark, exotic villainy of Dracula. Lugosi never disrespected the role that made him famous. On the contrary, he approached every appearance as Dracula with seriousness and dignity, committed to honoring the character's literary origins and tragic depth. It was the industry's narrow vision, not the character itself, that limited him. Lugosi yearned for greater variety, to play romantic leads, heroes, or complex dramatic figures, but Hollywood rarely gave him the opportunity. Financial difficulties compounded the challenges of typecasting. Despite the massive success of Dracula, Lugosi was not well compensated and struggled to secure stable income. His rivalry, real or perceived, with Boris Karloff, another towering figure of early horror cinema, only deepened the frustrations, as Karloff often received better roles and higher billing. As the years wore on, Lugosi's career declined. Health problems led to dependence on painkillers, and in a time when addiction was heavily stigmatized, he bravely sought treatment publicly, one of the first actors in Hollywood to do so. Despite his struggles, Lugosi continued working, appearing in low-budget productions and remaining devoted to his craft to the very end. When Bela Lugosi died in 1956, he was laid to rest wearing the costume of Count Dracula, not as a mockery, but as a symbol of pride. He understood that through Dracula, he had touched something eternal. His legacy endures not merely as an icon of horror, but as a symbol of passion, dedication, and the complex relationship between an artist and the role that defines him. Through Bela Lugosi, Dracula was not just a creature of the night. He was transformed into a figure of tragic majesty, forever haunting the silver screen. Clark Gable, often referred to as the King of Hollywood, had a career built on charm, rugged masculinity, and an effortless presence on screen. By the late 1930s, he was already a major star, known for his roles in films like It Happened One Night and Mutiny on the Bounty. Yet, no role would ever define him, or shadow him, more completely than that of Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. When casting began for the adaptation of Margaret Mitchell's epic novel, fan demand for Gable was overwhelming. Audiences and critics alike could imagine no one else in the role of the dashing, cynical Southern gentleman. But Gable himself was hesitant. He feared being trapped by the character, worried that the intense public expectations would turn the role into a cage rather than a crown. Producer David O. Selznick was relentless in his pursuit. Eventually, through a combination of financial incentives and studio pressure, Gable agreed to take the part. The filming of Gone with the Wind was grueling, a massive production fraught with delays, rewrites, and on-set tensions. Gable, though professional, reportedly found the experience draining, particularly disliking the emotional vulnerability required in key scenes, such as Rhett's final farewell to Scarlett O'Hara. Despite his reservations, Gable's performance was extraordinary. He embodied Rhett Butler with a natural ease, balancing roguish charm with profound emotional depth. His portrayal became iconic almost instantly, and Gone with the Wind would go on to become one of the most celebrated films in cinematic history. However, the overwhelming success of the film brought exactly the consequences Gable had feared. For the rest of his life, no matter what roles he played, whether in war films, comedies, or westerns, he remained, in the public's mind, Rhett Butler. Gable was proud of the film's success, but privately weary of how closely it clung to him, limiting how audiences and producers perceived his capabilities as an actor. After serving in the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II, Gable attempted to reshape his career, seeking more varied and substantial parts. Yet he found it difficult to escape the suave, smirking image that Rhett Butler had cemented. Even his later performances, such as in The Hucksters and Mogambo, while strong, never fully broke the public's association of Gable with the world of Tara and Scarlett. In interviews later in life, Gable spoke rarely of Gone with the Wind, preferring to focus on other aspects of his career. Though he remained gracious toward the fans who adored the film, there was a quiet sense of distance. A recognition that Rhett Butler had, in many ways, overshadowed the broader arc of his artistry. Clark Gable died in 1960, just after completing The Misfits, a film that many consider one of his finest performances. Today, he is rightly celebrated as one of the greatest stars of the Golden Age. Yet beneath the legend, there was a man who carried the heavy weight of having played a role so iconic it became nearly impossible to outrun. Through Rhett Butler, Clark Gable achieved immortality, and in doing so, he sacrificed a part of his freedom as an artist, a trade few outside Hollywood's brightest lights ever truly understand. Judy Garland's voice became the soundtrack of an entire generation's dreams. Born Frances Ethel Gumm in 1922, she was performing in vaudeville with her sisters before she was 10 years old. Her prodigious talent, a voice of astonishing emotional power combined with a natural gift for performance, caught the attention of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and soon she became one of the studio's brightest young stars. At just 16 years old, Garland was cast in the role that would define her forever, Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz, 1939. Her rendition of Over the Rainbow would go on to become one of the most beloved songs in American history, and the film itself, though only modestly successful at the time, eventually became a cultural cornerstone through television re-releases. However, behind the curtains of Technicolor magic, Garland's experience was anything but enchanting. The pressures placed upon her during the production were immense. MGM executives, obsessed with maintaining her image as the perfect girl next door, subjected her to a grueling regime of diet pills to keep her weight down and sleeping pills to ensure she rested between endless filming schedules. This brutal cycle initiated a lifelong struggle with dependency and self-image. The success of The Wizard of Oz cast a long, unyielding shadow over Garland's career. Despite her extraordinary versatility as a performer, she could sing, dance, act in both comedic and dramatic roles. Hollywood and the public often saw her first and foremost as Dorothy. Even as she matured into adulthood, the industry continued to cast her in youthful, innocent roles that clashed with the complex, often tormented woman she was becoming. Throughout the 1940s, Garland fought both personal demons and studio control, managing to deliver some of her most memorable performances in films like Meet Me in St. Louis and Easter Parade. Yet the internal battles raged on. Health issues, emotional breakdowns, and repeated stints in hospitals and rehabilitation clinics marked her private life, even as her public persona remained that of the smiling, singing star. By the early 1950s, after being labeled unreliable and let go by MGM, Garland found new life on the concert stage. Her performances were electrifying, raw, and deeply human. No longer hidden behind the manufactured innocence of Dorothy Gale, she stood before audiences as herself, vulnerable, passionate, and utterly unforgettable. Still, the image of Dorothy remained indelibly attached to her legacy. Even in her final years, despite acclaimed performances in films like A Star is Born and heartfelt concert appearances, many continued to associate her with the wide-eyed girl from Kansas skipping down the yellow brick road. Judy Garland died in 1969 at the age of 47, her life having been marked by extraordinary triumphs and devastating struggles. She remains one of the most gifted entertainers ever to grace the stage and screen, her voice continuing to echo across generations. Yet the role that first brought her fame was both a blessing and a burden. A symbol of dreams for millions, and a reminder, for Garland herself, of a youth and innocence that Hollywood demanded she never outgrow. Through her, Dorothy Gale lives forever. And in that eternal performance, Judy Garland found both immortality and the sorrow of being forever young. William Shatner's journey to stardom was marked by talent, determination, and a willingness to take bold risks. Born in Montreal in 1931, he began acting on Canadian stages before moving into American television and film. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Shatner built a steady career as a character actor, earning a reputation for his commanding voice and emotional range. When he was cast as Captain James T. Kirk in Star Trek in 1966, it was a role that would change his life forever. Kirk was bold, charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and deeply human, a futuristic leader for a turbulent era. Shatner's portrayal infused the character with energy, humor, and a moral seriousness that resonated strongly with audiences, even if Star Trek's initial run was modest in terms of ratings. However, what began as a steady job on a relatively low-budget science fiction series quickly grew into something far greater. After the show's cancellation in 1969, Star Trek found new life in syndication, building a passionate, growing fan base that transformed the series into a cultural phenomenon. Almost overnight, Shatner became synonymous with Captain Kirk. While the enduring popularity of Star Trek secured Shatner's place in pop culture history, it also cast a long shadow over the rest of his career. Despite his range and ambitions as an actor, from Shakespeare to complex contemporary drama, the industry and audiences often struggled to see him as anyone but the swashbuckling starship captain. The years following Star Trek's cancellation were difficult. Struggling to find substantial roles, Shatner faced periods of financial hardship, even living out of a camper van while taking whatever acting work he could find. He continued to perform with dedication, but the persistent association with Kirk made it challenging to be considered for parts that differed from the heroic archetype he had embodied. When Star Trek returned as a film franchise in the late 1970s, Shatner reprised his role, reuniting with his former castmates. Although this revitalized his career and provided new opportunities, it further cemented his identification with Captain Kirk. Every new Star Trek movie, every convention appearance, every interview reinforced the image. In time, Shatner came to embrace the character and the fandom that adored him. Rather than fighting against his own legacy, he leaned into it with wit, self-awareness, and a deep appreciation for the impact Star Trek had on generations of viewers. He expanded his career into writing, directing, and even releasing spoken-word music albums, continually finding new ways to express his creativity. Today, William Shatner is celebrated not just as Captain Kirk, but as a cultural icon, an actor who navigated the complexities of typecasting and emerged with humor, resilience, and an enduring sense of adventure. Yet behind the legend lies the truth of a man whose talents far exceeded a single role, and whose personal journey mirrored the voyage he once commanded among the stars. A quest to explore new worlds, to find new life, and to boldly go beyond the limits others set for him. Shirley Temple remains one of the most iconic child stars in the history of cinema. Born in 1928 in Santa Monica, California, she entered the entertainment world at the age of just 3. With her trademark curls, radiant smile, and precocious charm, Temple captured the hearts of audiences during the darkest years of the Great Depression, offering a symbol of innocence, hope, and resilience when America needed it most. By the mid-1930s, she was the #1 box office draw in the United States for 4 consecutive years, a feat no child performer has ever matched. Films like Bright Eyes, Curly Top, and Heidi became cultural touchstones, and Temple herself was more than a movie star. She was a phenomenon, her likeness appearing on countless products, her songs and dances known by heart to millions. However, behind the scenes, Shirley Temple's life was shaped by forces far beyond her control. Studio executives and publicists meticulously crafted her image, emphasizing her perpetual youth, sweetness, and innocence. Every aspect of her public persona was tightly managed, and as a result, Shirley grew up under intense pressure to maintain a version of herself that matched the public's imagination, a challenge that would grow increasingly difficult with time. As she entered adolescence, Temple faced the harsh reality that Hollywood had little interest in a maturing Shirley Temple. Audiences who had adored her as a child were less willing to accept her as a teenager, and the studio struggled to find roles that matched her evolving identity. Her transition into more adult performances, such as in The Bachelor and The Bobby Soxer and That Hagen Girl, met with only modest success, and the magic that had seemed effortless as a child proved much harder to sustain in adulthood. Recognizing the shifting tides, Temple made the remarkable decision to step away from acting at the young age of 22. She understood what many in Hollywood refused to admit, that the industry had loved the symbol she represented more than the person she was becoming. Far from retreating into obscurity, Shirley Temple went on to build a second, equally remarkable career. She dedicated herself to public service, becoming a skilled diplomat and serving as the United States ambassador to Ghana and later to Czechoslovakia. In these roles, she earned respect not because of her celebrity, but because of her intelligence, grace, and unwavering commitment to her duties. Throughout her life, Temple carried herself with dignity, rarely speaking bitterly about her early fame. She acknowledged the blessings her early career had given her, even as she recognized the sacrifices it demanded. Today, Shirley Temple stands not only as America's sweetheart, but as a symbol of resilience. A rare figure who managed to evolve beyond the limits of early fame, redefining herself with quiet strength and enduring grace. Robert Mitchum's name is forever associated with the image of the cool, detached tough guy, the archetype of film noir's shadowy heroes and anti-heroes. Born in 1917 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Mitchum lived a difficult early life, marked by poverty, rebellion, and stints working a series of hard manual jobs across the country. His ruggedness wasn't a cultivated act. It was a product of genuine experience. When he entered Hollywood in the early 1940s, Mitchum initially worked as an extra and bit player, slowly building a reputation for his authenticity and screen presence. His breakthrough came with a series of war films, culminating in an Academy Award nomination for the story of G.I. Joe in 1945. But it was in the world of film noir, with titles like Out of the Past and Crossfire, that Mitchum truly found his persona cemented. On screen, Mitchum became the embodiment of a certain post-war American spirit, cynical yet vulnerable, weary yet resilient, projecting toughness without losing the quiet sorrow beneath. His trademark laconic delivery, his half-lidded gaze, and his effortless cool captivated audiences, creating an indelible image of masculinity that Hollywood eagerly embraced. Yet, for Mitchum himself, the persona of the tough guy was never something he particularly admired or sought to perpetuate. In interviews, he often spoke of acting as simply a job, one he did professionally but without personal pretension. He viewed Hollywood's attempts to label him narrowly with a mixture of amusement and resignation. In truth, Robert Mitchum was a man of complex intellect and broad artistic interests, a reader, a poet, and a musician, whose private world was far richer than the roles he was typically offered. Throughout his career, Mitchum consistently resisted being defined by one archetype. He sought out varied and challenging parts, demonstrating his range in films like Heaven Knows, Mr. Allison, The Night of the Hunter, and The Friends of Eddie Coyle. Yet despite his best efforts, audiences and studios often preferred him in roles that matched the myth they had created. The loner, the drifter, the world-weary man who said little and knew too much. Mitchum handled this duality with a certain stoic humor. He never publicly raged against the machine of typecasting. Instead, he approached his work with a professionalism that belied the complexity of his feelings. He was well aware of the contradictions between his public image and his private aspirations, but he accepted them with a pragmatism that was very much his own. By the time of his passing in 1997, Robert Mitchum had left behind a body of work that reflected both the archetype he had come to define and the deeper, more nuanced artist he truly was. His legacy endures not simply because he played tough guys so convincingly, but because within those roles, he managed to suggest the inner lives of men shaped by hardship, loss, and unspoken dreams. In Robert Mitchum's performances, one can sense not only the toughness of survival, but also the quiet yearning of a man who was far more than the sum of the myths surrounding him. Joan Crawford's career is a testament to resilience, reinvention, and the complicated relationship between stardom and personal identity. Born Lucille Fay LeSueur in 1904, Crawford's ascent to fame was not the product of privilege or luck, but of relentless ambition, an unwavering work ethic, and a keen understanding of the Hollywood machine. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Crawford became one of MGM's most valuable stars, often portraying independent, modern women who embodied the aspirations of a generation seeking escape from the constraints of tradition. Films like Our Dancing Daughters and Grand Hotel established her as a symbol of glamour and strength. Her carefully crafted image, a mix of determination and allure, resonated deeply with audiences navigating the uncertainties of the Great Depression. Yet, as she entered her 40s, Crawford faced a brutal reality: Hollywood's obsession with youth. Offers began to dwindle, and whispers in the industry labeled her as box office poison, a term devastating to any actor's career. Refusing to be discarded, Crawford left MGM and signed with Warner Brothers, determined to reshape her path. Her comeback came with Mildred Pierce, 1945, a performance that would win her an Academy Award and redefine her place in Hollywood history. As Mildred, the self-sacrificing mother struggling against social and personal tragedy, Crawford tapped into raw emotional depth, showcasing a vulnerability that critics and audiences had never fully seen before. However, this triumph carried an unforeseen consequence. Hollywood, quick to capitalize on a successful image, began to see Crawford almost exclusively through the lens of suffering and endurance. She was repeatedly cast as women who endured betrayal, hardship, and heartbreak, roles that, while often brilliantly performed, confined her to a narrow emotional space. Crawford's later career featured a series of melodramas and psychological thrillers, where her characters fought against aging, manipulation, and loss. Films like Sudden Fear and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane kept her in the public eye, but they also reinforced the image of the stoic, embattled woman, a far cry from the vibrant modernity she had once represented. In private, Crawford maintained a fiercely controlled persona, guarding her dignity even as the industry's demands grew more merciless. Her devotion to perfection, both on and off the screen, became legendary, a reflection of a woman who understood that in Hollywood, survival required constant vigilance. Today, Joan Crawford is remembered not only for her extraordinary film legacy, but also as a symbol of the costs exacted by an industry that builds myths only to confine them. She was a woman of immense talent and willpower, who transformed herself countless times to meet the demands of an ever-changing world, but who in doing so, found herself caged within the very roles that had secured her immortality. Marlon Brando's arrival in Hollywood marked a turning point in the history of acting. Trained under the tutelage of Stella Adler and heavily influenced by the principles of the Stanislavski system, Brando brought a depth of realism and emotional truth to the screen that audiences had rarely witnessed before. His performances were not mere portrayals, they were lived experiences, rich with nuance and internal conflict. In 1951, Brando delivered the role that would forever define a part of his legacy: Stanley Kowalski in Elia Kazan's adaptation of Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. On stage and on screen, Brando's portrayal was a revelation. Stanley was raw, volatile, deeply human, a character that embodied a new, unfiltered approach to masculinity in American cinema. Brando's performance was so compelling, so immediate, that it shattered traditional notions of leading men, creating a blueprint for a new generation of actors. Yet for Brando, the role became a double-edged sword. Although A Streetcar Named Desire catapulted him to stardom, it also created a public image he found increasingly burdensome. Audiences and industry executives alike began to see him primarily through the lens of Stanley, as an intense, brooding force of nature, overlooking the vast range of his artistic ambitions. Brando, however, was never content to be confined by any single archetype. He was a student of complex human behavior, drawn to characters who reflected the contradictions, vulnerabilities, and aspirations of real life. Roles in films such as On the Waterfront, Viva Zapata, and The Young Lions demonstrated his remarkable versatility and his refusal to be typecast. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Brando struggled with the expectations placed upon him by the public and the studios. He often expressed frustration with Hollywood's commercialism, resisting the pressures to replicate earlier successes. His career choices reflected a restless spirit, at times brilliant, at times confounding, but always driven by a desire for authenticity rather than approval. Despite his efforts, the shadow of Stanley Kowalski lingered. Interviews and articles frequently circled back to that early triumph, as if the complexity of his later work could be distilled into a single, youthful performance. Brando himself came to view aspects of his fame with skepticism, regarding it as a distraction from the work he truly cared about. In the later stages of his career, Brando found new avenues for his talent in landmark performances, such as Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather and Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. These roles showcased a profound maturity, offering portraits of men grappling with power, mortality, and the weight of their own decisions. Marlon Brando remains one of the most transformative figures in cinematic history, an artist who expanded the possibilities of screen acting and redefined what it meant to tell human stories through film. Yet behind the genius was a man forever aware of the tension between the myth and the individual, between the image the world projected onto him and the truth he sought to express. Through Stanley Kowalski, Brando changed cinema, but he spent the rest of his life reminding the world, and perhaps himself, that he was infinitely more than any single role could ever capture.